The fog rolled thick through the cramped alleyways of Whitechapel on that November morning in 1888, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and something far worse, the sweet, cloying stench of death. Mary Kelly pulled her threadbare shawl tighter against the cold as she hurried past the narrow doorways, where women like herself waited in the shadows, their hollow eyes tracking every passing gentleman. She didn't know it yet, but she had less than 48 hours to live. In the darkness of Miller's Court, a killer was already preparing his knives, and Mary would become the fifth and final victim of the man the penny dreadfuls called Jack the Ripper. But her story, and the stories of the thousands who lived and died in Victorian London's most notorious slum, speaks to something far darker than one madman's crimes. It reveals the true horror of the Victorian age, a horror written not in blood on cobblestones, but in the systematic brutality of poverty, disease, and despair that ground millions of souls into dust beneath the glittering facade of the British Empire. Before we continue with Mary's story and journey deeper into the shadows of Victorian Britain, I want to take a moment to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Every subscription helps support this community of history enthusiasts and ensures we can continue bringing these forgotten stories back to life. These narratives matter. They remind us of the real people who lived, struggled, and died in ages past. People whose experiences shaped the world we inhabit today. Your support makes this work possible, so please take a second to hit that subscribe button. Now, let's return to the gaslit streets of 1888 and uncover the truth about what it meant to be poor in the wealthiest city on earth. The London that Mary Kelly knew bore little resemblance to the glittering capital celebrated in the novels of Charles Dickens or the paintings that hung in the Royal Academy. While Queen Victoria reigned from Buckingham Palace and the sun never set on British territorial possessions spanning a quarter of the globe, the East End of London festered like an open wound. In Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Bethnal Green, hundreds of thousands of people existed in conditions that would have shocked medieval peasants. They crowded into rotting tenement buildings where entire families occupied single rooms, measuring no more than 10 feet by 12. The walls ran with damp, breeding colonies of black mold that filled the lungs of children who rarely lived to see their 5th birthday. In winter, frost formed on the inside of the windows, when there were windows at all. Many families simply nailed sacking across the frames to keep out the worst of the cold. The streets themselves presented a tableau of human misery that assaulted every sense. Open sewers ran down the middle of the thoroughfares, mixing with the waste from slaughterhouses, tanneries, and dye works. Rats scurried boldly in broad daylight, grown fat on refuse. The air hung heavy with smoke from tens of thousands of coal fires, mixing with the fog to create the infamous pea soupers that could reduce visibility to mere feet and left a greasy residue on every surface. During particularly bad episodes of fog, people literally suffocated in the streets, their lungs unable to extract enough oxygen from the poisoned air. The death toll during these events could reach into the hundreds, though the bodies of the poor were rarely counted with much precision. Mary Kelly had come to London from Ireland, one of hundreds of thousands who fled that cursed land after the famine of the 1840s. The potato blight had killed more than 1 million Irish people outright and forced another 2 million to flee, many to the already overcrowded cities of industrial England. They arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs, speaking with accents that marked them as foreigners in a land that despised them. The English called them dirty, stupid, criminal, and violent. Newspaper cartoonists drew them with ape-like features, barely human. They took the jobs no one else would take, shoveling coal in the depths of steamships, hauling bricks on construction sites, or descending into the sewers to clear blockages with their bare hands. For women, the options were even more limited. They could work in factories, standing at machines for 14 hours a day until exhaustion or injury claimed them. They could take in piecework, sewing shirts or making matchboxes in their rooms for wages that barely bought bread. Or they could do what Mary eventually did, walk the streets and sell the only thing they still possessed. By 1888, it was estimated that 80,000 prostitutes worked in London alone, though the real number was likely far higher. Most were not the glamorous courtesans of French paintings, but women like Mary, desperate, alcoholic, disease-ridden creatures who serviced dock workers and labourers in dark alleys for the price of a gin. The economic machinery of Victorian Britain operated on principles that we would find shocking today, yet which were considered not merely acceptable, but morally righteous by the era's ruling classes. The philosophers of political economy had declared that poverty resulted from individual moral failing rather than systemic injustice. If people were poor, the reasoning went, it was because they were lazy, improvident, or given to drink. The solution was not to improve their circumstances, but to make those circumstances even more punishing, thereby incentivizing them to work harder and live more virtuously. This philosophy found its purest expression in the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, which established the workhouse system that would torment the lives of millions. The workhouses were institutions designed to be so thoroughly unpleasant that only the truly desperate would enter them. Families were immediately separated upon admission. Husbands torn from wives, mothers from children, siblings scattered to different wings of the building. They wore uniforms marked with large letters identifying them as paupers. They performed mind-numbing labor for hours each day, picking oakum until their fingers bled, crushing bones for fertilizer, or walking treadmills that served no purpose except punishment. The food was deliberately kept at subsistence levels, a thin gruel or watery soup accompanied by a small portion of bread. Many inmates suffered from scurvy, rickets, and other diseases of malnutrition, even while supposedly under the care of the state. The elderly wasted away on hard wooden beds. Children who had committed no crime, except being born poor, found themselves imprisoned in institutions barely distinguishable from jails. Charles Dickens famously satirized the workhouse system in Oliver Twist, published in 1837, but his critique did little to change the fundamental brutality of the institution. If anything, the workhouses became more punitive as the century progressed. The boards of guardians who administered them competed to see who could make their workhouse the least appealing, the most efficient at deterring all but the absolutely destitute from seeking relief. When scandals erupted, when it was discovered that inmates were eating candles for the fat, or that children were being systematically starved, or that the insane were being chained in cellars, there would be a brief outcry, perhaps an investigation, and then business would continue as usual. The system was working exactly as intended. Outside the workhouse walls, the factories and mills of industrial Britain consumed human lives with mechanical efficiency. Children, as young as 5 years old, worked in textile mills, their small fingers perfect for reaching into the machinery to clear jammed threads. When they grew tired and slumped toward the moving parts, overseers beat them with leather straps to keep them alert. Those who fell asleep anyway often paid with their hands or their lives. The factory owners calculated that it was more economical to hire new children than to install safety equipment. Boys worked as climbing boys for chimney sweeps, sent up narrow flues to brush out the soot while the fires were still warm enough to burn their feet, ensuring they climbed quickly. Many became trapped and suffocated, their bodies sometimes not discovered for weeks. Girls worked in match factories, exposed to white phosphorus that caused a condition called phossy jaw. The bones of the jaw would literally rot away, leaving gaping holes in the face and a stench of putrefaction that marked the victims for life. Most died of the condition within a few agonizing years. The coal mines presented their own horrors. Women and children hauled baskets of coal through tunnels so low they had to crawl on hands and knees, often through water or mud. They wore harnesses like beasts of burden, chains running between their legs to drag sledges loaded with coal behind them. The work destroyed their bodies, leaving them bent and broken by their 20s. The men who actually cut the coal faced different dangers: roof collapses that buried them alive, explosions of methane gas that incinerated entire crews, and the slow death of black lung disease that filled their airways with coal dust until they suffocated. Mining disasters that killed dozens or even hundreds of workers were regular occurrences, noted in the newspapers and then forgotten as the companies resumed operations with fresh labourers. Disease stalked the Victorian poor with a persistence that made their lives a daily gamble with death. Cholera swept through the crowded slums in waves, killing thousands at a time. The disease caused such violent diarrhea that victims literally evacuated their bodies of water, their skin turning blue and papery as they dried out from the inside. They died in agony, often within 24 hours of the first symptoms. Typhus, tuberculosis, smallpox, and scarlet fever maintained a constant presence, culling the weakest and youngest with ruthless efficiency. Child mortality rates in the poorest districts reached staggering levels. In some areas, more than half of all children born died before their 5th birthday. Parents grew hardened to loss, knowing that of the 8 or 10 children they might bear, perhaps 3 or 4 would survive to adulthood. The medical establishment of the time offered little help to the poor. Doctors were gentlemen who treated gentlemen. They had no interest in venturing into the pestilent slums to tend to patients who could never pay. The poor instead relied on a hodgepodge of folk remedies, quack medicines, and penny doctors whose qualifications were dubious at best. When someone in the family fell seriously ill, the choice was often simple: let them die at home or send them to the hospital, which amounted to nearly the same thing. The hospitals of Victorian London were places of horror where patients lay on filthy mattresses, their wounds crawling with maggots, while surgeons operated without anaesthesia or antiseptics, wiping their bloody instruments on their coats between patients. The mortality rate from surgery approached 50% for major operations. Many people viewed admission to a hospital as a death sentence and would do almost anything to avoid it. Yet, even in these circles of hell, people managed to find moments of community, pleasure, and defiance. The pub culture of Victorian London provided a refuge from the grinding misery of daily life. In the gin palaces of the East End, decorated with gaudy mirrors and gaslights, working people could forget their troubles for a few hours. They drank cheap gin, mother's ruin they called it, which was often adulterated with turpentine or sulfuric acid to increase its potency and stretch the profits. Addiction was rampant and socially acceptable. In a world where clean water was often unavailable and every day brought fresh suffering, alcohol offered a reliable escape. Women drank as heavily as men, sometimes more so. It was not uncommon to